Καλησπέρα και πάλι από εμάς.
Good
Ήρθε η ώρα
evening, everybody.
στη δεύτερη θεματική
We can go into the second part of our
της Εμπρού.
conference that is the memory of Ebru.
Δεύτερης θεματικής έχει να κάνει
The
με το
topic
δίκαιο ως πεδίο
of
πάλι
this part has to do with our struggle in law and the role of law in the struggle for rights and freedoms. As an introduction, let me say that law as a social mechanism throughout history, especially when the struggle path was especially acute, is not just an abstract mechanism, but it's an instrument that can either be used as an institution of oppression by capital imperialism and the state, or can function for the sake of freedom, for the rights of working people and nations. In our discussion, we have participants from various countries, something that we believe is an important initiative, so that by these dialogues we can highlight the role of law in the struggle for freedoms and rights. Our first participant is lawyer Ebre Lalia from the Philippines, president of People's Lawyers from the Philippines. We can hear you. Have the floor.
Dimitris, good afternoon, everybody. I was requested to share my legal opinion on the national liberation and the right to resistance under international humanitarian law. Many armed conflicts today involve so-called non-state actors, or specifically non-state armed groups. The traditional view is that these conflicts are governed by national law and fall within the exclusive jurisdiction of the states in which they are taking place, or against whose governments the non-state actors are fighting. A more progressive view to international law has rapidly evolved and developed, especially in the field of human rights, that challenges state-centric notions of sovereignty and exclusive jurisdiction, even when it comes to issues traditionally considered within the purview of internal security. The progressive view recognizes that the protection and promotion of human rights and dignity are also concerns of the international community, that states as well as individuals have obligations under international law in relation to human rights, and that non-state actors or belligerents can demand a recognition of their rights and status under international law. Developments in international relations and legal thought came with the emergence of newly independent states and a wave of social movements, especially national liberation movements, or NLMs for short, exercising the right of and to self-determination. That period was ripe for a categorical recognition of the rights that underpin anti-colonial struggles and the process of decolonization then happening around the world, and that recognition necessarily warranted a re-examination of international law principles and, in particular, the legal status of armed movements and the non-state actors involved in them. Through numerous resolutions of the UN General Assembly, the international community firmly recognized the existence of a people's right of self-determination and the legitimacy of waging armed struggle to secure this right. The said right is mentioned in the 1945 UN Charter, the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights also implies the existence of a right to engage in armed struggle when it concedes that human rights must be protected, quote, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse, as a last resort, though, to rebellion against tyranny and oppression. 1977 saw the adoption of Protocol 1, additional to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, that laid out the rules on the conduct of hostilities and the protection of civilians in international armed conflicts, or IAC, International Armed Conflicts, or IAC for short. Its Article 1, Paragraph 4, in relation to Article 96, Paragraph 3, effectively expanded the concept of an IAC to include situations in which peoples are fighting against colonial domination and alien occupation, and against racist regimes in the exercise of the right of self-determination. From a legal perspective, Protocol 1 was a pivotal moment because it internationalized armed struggle for self-determination carried out by non-state actors. In practical terms, it also meant that other provisions of the 1949 Geneva Conventions would be applicable to wars of liberation. The conservative view is that the list in Article 1, Paragraph 4 is exhaustive. Hence, only NLMs exercising the right of self-determination in one of the three situations, colonial domination, alien occupation, and racist regimes, are treated as international armed conflicts. This traditional interpretation of Protocol 1 has been widely criticized as restrictive and outdated, and limits its scope by excluding certain armed movements from its application. Okay. I have to slow down because I'm excited. The progressive view is that the situations referred to in Article 1, Paragraph 4 of Protocol 1 are not exhaustive or exclusive, but merely illustrative. There are strong persuasive views that the use of armed force in pursuit of the right of self-determination, not only against the classical colonial domination, alien occupation, and racist regimes, but also against all other forms of neo-colonialism, systemic and systematic oppression and repression of peoples, must also be recognized as a legitimate means of resistance in this context. Protocol 1 was itself the outcome of earlier developments concerning the recognition of the legitimacy of NLMs and the fundamental right of self-determination and the internationally recognized right of a people to assert itself against the state by any means at its disposal, including the use of armed force. As mentioned, various UN General Assembly resolutions and declarations, which I can provide if you are so interested later on, over the years, categorically reaffirm the legitimacy of people's struggles for independence, territorial integrity, and liberation from such domination and occupation in the exercise of the right of self-determination, and I quote, by all available means, including armed struggle, close quote, or, quote, by any means at their disposal, close quote. Those are not my words. Those are the words of the UN. IHL conventions and these international instruments and declarations, both globally and regionally, because there are, apart from other parallel documents and, of course, the history of people's struggles in many parts of the world, have been construed to have legalized the use of armed means to assert the right to self-determination by NLMs. Even as the term neo-colonialism evades exact legal definition by international law sources, neo-colonialism and its various manifestations are a continuing reality, particularly for former colonies. The effect is essentially and fundamentally the same as that of colonialism. The interests of the neo-colonies are subordinated to those of foreign powers, and the people of the neo-colonies are prevented from attaining the full scope of self-determination in the realization of their own independent development. Since neo-colonialism continues to prevent neo-colonized states from fully realizing their independence, hence a broad interpretation of Article 1, Paragraph 4 of Protocol 1 is warranted. Therefore, the use of armed force in the struggle against neocolonialism, systemic and systematic oppression, and the repression of peoples ought to bring the NLMs engaged in it within the scope of Protocol 1. Accordingly, the conflicts engendered by such people's struggles are in fact internationalized, while the NLMs involved in these struggles are infused with an international personality and its corresponding rights and obligations under IHL. This progressive view is more consistent with the objective of humanitarian law, which is to minimize the destruction brought by war through the regulation of as many situations of armed conflict and the inclusion of as many people within its protection as possible without adverse distinction based on the nature or origin of the armed conflict or on the causes espoused by or attributed to the belligerent parties. Moreover, such a liberal interpretation follows the increasingly progressive trend and view that NLMs have legal standing in international law in the context of the struggle for self-determination. Indeed, there is cogent legal basis to support the proposition that the right of self-determination may be exercised if there is a consistent pattern of gross and proven violations of human rights amounting to a denial of the people's right to freely determine its internal and external political and economic status. Therefore, IHL views national liberation movements and their actors as belligerents who are governed by the laws of the armed conflict. That is to say, their actions are measured against the basic principles of distinction, particularly between civilians and combatants, and precaution as to the objects of attacks, as well as of necessity and proportionality as to the means and methods of warfare. Consequently, the progressive view is that actions taken by national liberation movements, or NLMs, against legitimate objects of attack in an armed conflict and in observance of other IHL principles cannot be treated or labeled as terrorism. Otherwise, it allows such actions to be criminalized under counterterrorism frameworks, even though they are clearly valid under IHL. Having recognized their locus standi in international law and their use of armed force in the context and framework of IHL, these NLM entities and their actors, as well as, and even more importantly, those who do not take part in armed hostilities like civilians and hors de combat or out of combat, have rights and are protected by IHL. NLM and their actors, revolutionaries or belligerents, cannot therefore be regarded as terrorists. It is in such context and framework that one can assert that one's genuine freedom fighter cannot be another's terrorist. Equally important, if not more significant, is the moral mandate provided by the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Peoples of 1976, which is known as the Algiers Declaration, that explicitly recognized the people's right to development as well as the right of self-determination and liberation. It recognized that peoples have the right, if they are under subjection, to fight for their liberation, whether direct or indirect. This declaration presents a clear principle for national liberation movements, and their combatants are entitled to the protection of humanitarian law. Yet, governments at war with LLMs or whose geopolitical interests are threatened have pushed back through legal frameworks designed to deny the social issues that gave rise to these conflicts. Governments often refer to such non-state armed groups as outlaws, common criminals, terrorists, or by other appellations that portray the conflict as purely internal, caused by criminal elements, rather than a people's struggle to exercise an internationally recognized right. Recent years, as we know, saw the extensive use by governments of so-called counterterrorism frameworks and narratives. Through counterterrorism legislation, governments criminalize all acts performed by parties designated as terrorists. The widespread application of counterterrorism frameworks in armed conflicts has significant and often deleterious repercussions. Governments also use counterterrorism frameworks to deny their obligations under IHL, evade accountability, reduce civic space, and weaken democratic institutions. The bigger implication is that any terrorist label designation for purported acts by LLMs is contrary to IHL and is a regression of international law and even domestic jurisprudential principles on legitimate political action. I have to slow down, okay. Designating the adverse party in an armed conflict as terrorists in all armed operations, including those against legitimate military targets as terrorism, would not only frustrate efforts to reach an honorable peace settlement or resolution, but also discourage compliance with IHL and even obstruct humanitarian aid in conflict zones. This approach also obfuscates the various violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Viewed from a historical perspective, the emergence and preferred use of counterterrorism frameworks constitute a reaction to the rapid advance of the progressive view in international law that recognizes the legitimacy of liberation movements. It remains a continuing call and challenge, therefore, for national liberation movements and the organizations involved in them, and even those that simply acknowledge and respect their basic right to resistance, to assert their legitimacy and standing under international law, and to advocate for the continued application of IHL in situations of armed conflict. The established right of self-determination and the right of NLMs to engage in armed struggle are already bedrocks for the development of even more progressive views of armed conflict that could serve to counter reactionary ones that are currently being bombarded, especially on the uninformed and unenlightened public consciousness. In closing, so what is wrong with armed struggle in the above legal context? What is wrong? Nothing. There is nothing wrong with armed struggle in the above legal context. It is recognized under international law as legally permissible and as a valid response to systemic and systematic oppression and repression of peoples. Should armed struggle in the context of international law be spoken in whispers, hushed tones? It need not be. There is no need to be defensive about discussing, recognizing, respecting, or even asserting, and for those who choose so, in exercising an inherent and universal right. So, my topic is law as a field of struggle, the role of law in the struggle for rights and freedoms. How do you use the law, as Dimitris has said? In the Philippine context, and I know in many other parts of the world, you can use the law against the oppressors, against the fascists, all right? Or you can use it to develop your own law. With this in mind, and I'm about to close, let the people continue to write their own history to counter the dominant narrative of reaction, transform and even make their own laws from the perspective of the oppressed. Indeed, let the whispers and rustles of this legitimate option of righteous indignation against tyrannies and imperialists reverberate, as it were, from the rivers of struggles to the seas of people's victory for genuine freedom and democracy. Thank you. I'm sorry. I overstepped my time.
Ευχαριστούμε τον Εδρέ για αυτή την αναλυτική και μεστή παρουσίαση τη σχέση, θα λέγαμε, δικαίου, κανόνων δικαίου, αλλά και της αναγνώρισης των
Thank you very
δικαιωμάτων.
much for this very detailed presentation about the rule of law in the part of struggle and the right to resist. I think it was a very thorough presentation about the way that law as a product of history, as a product of social force relations, can be a compass for the progression of social struggle and as a compass for the evolution of our struggles in the future, how we can inform those historical conditions so that from the law of oppression we pass into the liberational mechanism of law. Our next speaker is from Greece, is Kostas Papadakis. He's a lawyer of Athens, and he's become a member of the Lawyer Association of Greece. Kostas Papadakis, you have the floor. Thank you very much, our friend. Thank you very much for the invitation. I also wanted to honor Brutin Tik's memory, and I also wanted to honor the struggle of the Turkish fighters and militants whose faces we see in these posters around us. I welcome everybody here, people coming from all over the world to take part in this international congress about law and justice. As you all know, law is considered to be all this set of rules by which power is exerted and the relations between citizens and between countries are regulated. Law is a set of rules of class, our political power, no matter if they try to cover it up, talking about equality. Of course, law is a historically produced human product of a circumstantial character that is based on particular principles and so on, like we have like they try to convince us about the neutral character of law. It's a product that has to do with the first that came to exist with the first societies, and of course its rules are based on changing moral principles that change according to a society and time. The law is not like this because it must be like this, but it is like this because it is like this. The law does not create exploitation and production, but it imposes it. It follows it, no matter the different interpretations, the vague character of these interpretations. Still, what is clear is that the powers that be are based on law. It is the basis of the economic and social organization, having an important ideological function that has to do with the formation of subjects, ideology and set of mind, and how it interacts with these subjugated classes. Of course, there are various changes, various variations. Sometimes they don't manage to impose these, depending on the place and time. That has to do with the dialectic relation between law and society, between the evolution of law and a society. But it can we can never ignore the class interpretation of law, because laws are based on particular choices that not always reflect the class character of law. Even the first Marxist thinkers, Marx and Engels, discussed the notion of law. They rejected Hegel's idealistic approach, We are talking about the time of the First International, when there were huge ideological pressures from on the one part, from the anarchist movement that did not accept the bourgeois state, but would not say anything about how to topple the capitalist power. And on the other hand, we had social democratic currents that for many decades, almost until the October Revolution and even later, created problems for the Marxist movement, considering law as a neutral notion that it's impossible to be used under a different class power. It was a neutral and universal. Of course, every social organization is not neutral and universal. Is different according to the class. When the workers' class takes power, it means that it has to change the law, or else we are never going to have a classless society. Like the Soviet Union never managed to accomplish a class-free society. I remember what, let me remind you what Bakunin said. Bakunin said, if the proletariat comes to power and exerts its power, who will have its power over? And Marx, on the Gotha program critique, said that in capitalist production, the equal law is unequal law for unequal work, because it does not recognize class differences, as everyone is just a worker, but it recognizes as physical persons the unequal skills and powers. But unequal things can be measured only with an unequal person. So this so-called equal law is unequal. And Marx also said in the 18th of Brumaire, said that every bourgeois liberty has an upper moment and a down moment. Sometimes it establishes itself and then it is toppled. The moment when it is toppled is when the oppressed classes are trying to topple this law. Every time when we question the powers that be, Lenin, on his book on Kautsky, said that there is no state, not even the most democratic one, that does not include in its constitution some loopholes that give the bourgeois class the power to use the army against the workers, to call on a military law. And when the exploited classes wants to set itself free, then they also have loopholes to fight its struggle. No power that comes from an unjust system is able to give justice. And this so-called equality in inequality is not justice. That's why I do not call bourgeois justice, because it does not merit, it's not worth this title of justice, although we call it justice, and unfortunately a big part of the left calls bourgeois justice as justice. Of course, law is not only about legislation, it has to do about interpretation, these vague gaps of interpretation, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not, in the way of the law is applied and implemented. So we have a framework that makes sure that the bourgeois power is established, and all possibilities of using law against the interest of the dominant class are limited to the maximum. But as I said before, the law, the thought that the law is not a tool We are against this law, and of course, our fight against power has to do with also must include our fight against that law, sometimes inside the rule of law, sometimes outside the rules of law. In Greece, we have a long tradition, and I'm sure you have this in other countries, a slogan that says that the laws are abolished on the street with demonstrations and so on. We have to demystify, of course, the role of the ideological and social role of law, and we should not consider it as a universal thing above classes, government, social systems. It's an angel-made system that we have to serve it. What the law contains depends on class struggle. Sometimes it contains achievements and victories of the workers' class. Other times it is against the working class. Sometimes, even when its content is against the people, we still can make it useless for the dominant classes in some points. And sometimes, when in theory it is in favor of the working classes, still the established order can make it useless. The capitalist law or feudalism before that, which established, which the new bourgeois class had the separation of powers, although this does not mean that every power serves different purposes. Even the executive, the justice, the legislative power, they all serve the same legal order, and that means that their separation of the three powers, to the extent that it exists, does not mean that they serve different bosses. That the justice system, for example, in most countries and in Greece, is not accountable to anybody, is not elected, whereas the executive power, officially at least, is elected and should be accountable to the people, at least on paper. The separation of powers with the new bourgeois law system gave citizens the right to defend themselves against the state and created the institution of the lawyer, the advocacy. Regarding lawyers, as the people before me said today, I have to repeat that rules in advocacy go hand in hand with the rule of law that we saw after the First World War. And we had many rights, like the European Convention for Human Rights and the International Agreement or Convention of 1986 for Human Rights, and also the 1945 United Nations Congress, where the notion of and the concept of human rights were established. And there are other congresses that followed that gave a follow-up to these notions of human rights. And regarding advocacy, we had the so-called 8th Congress in Havana, Cuba, 1990, in which issued the decision B3 about title Basic Principles on the Role of Lawyers. Regarding this, we have to say that it was a need of the Western world to establish rights and achievements that derived from the struggles of all peoples in the previous time, and secondly, to show off its moral superiority toward the big rival at that time, the Soviet Union, which pushed the West to at least come up with such a declaration. Such declarations are wonderful in words, at least, but we know that the powers that be only are governed by interest, not by principles. Thus, those principles did not impede in one of the most developed countries of the West, that is West Germany, long before Germany, to send to prison, long before Turkey, to send many lawyers in the 1980s just because they defended the Baader-Meinhof militants. So West Germany sent their lawyers to prison. This meant that they trumped the right to defense, supposedly, as they say, because they were in cahoots, they were hand in hand with the terrorists. So we had the Havana Declaration about the role of lawyers, talking about achievements we had, like the presumption of innocence, the fair trial for poor people, the secrecy in communication with lawyer, a right that it's trumped on in many countries even nowadays, and also the access to lawyers for everybody, no matter if they can afford it or not. Also, it and also it achieved many. It included many other rights regarding lawyers, regarding also the duties and the responsibility of lawyers. I'm referring to especially to points 17, 18, 19 of the Havana Declaration regarding rights related to lawyers. The point 17 says that wherever the security of lawyers is threatened in the exercise of their duties, lawyers should be properly protected by the authorities. Point 18, lawyers should not be identified with their clients or the cases of their clients in the course of their duties. Point 20, lawyers should not be reliable for declarations that they do in good faith, written or orally, in the exercise of their duties in courts of law or in other legal contexts. I'm sure that if our prisoners in Turkey listen to me now in the prisons of Turkey, they will start laughing they will start laughing at all these wonderful words that supposedly that even Turkey has signed, all these wonderful declarations. But there are many lawyers that are now in Turkish prisons just because they followed the UN declarations. Some of them even lost their lives, and there are always beacons of freedom like Ebru Timtik, but not only her. Loyal defense in the times after the Havana Declaration from 1960 till today, in most European capitalist countries was radicalized, was massivized. We had, and now the notion of lawyer defender, I will refer to it, who defended victims at the cost of their own rights, sometimes their imprisonment and losing their lives in Turkey. In Europe, in Greece, we had Poulidis, Mandilaras, lawyers who lost their lives. The first one was executed by paramilitaries outside the courts of law in 1948. The second one, Mandilaras, was assassinated by the Greek dictatorship in 1968, and many others. Today, after many, many years, lawyers unquestionably helped defend rights, liberties, freedoms, procedural guarantees. They defended the workers. They defended them regarding their detention conditions against police violence. They defended strikes, demonstrations, refugees, immigrants, points of international law. Let's not forget that some of our colleagues, the previous months, they successfully fought in The Hague, regarding the Israeli genocide of Palestine. They were victorious no matter if the decision of the Security Council are executed or not, not based on legal principles, but based on the power of countries like the United States. This is something very revealing of the conflicts of law that I mentioned before, that we should not kid ourselves that even if we achieve victories through the institutions of law, which at some level do function and do help us move forward, still today there is a real danger for our profession, that is actually a danger for the liberties and freedoms that advocacy defends. Because based on the struggles of lawyers in class struggle from the 1960s till today, the bourgeoisie is now trying to transform advocacy, to change its social consciousness, to disorient it, and transform it in a different economic way. What do I mean? First of all, the production of a massive lawyers proletariat, that is, paid lawyers, salaried lawyers who work for big advocacy lawyers firms and companies, in NGOs, in other lawyers offering free defense services, that a system that works awfully in Greece, that does not help all these people to get their rights, to have their rights defended. So this new lawyers proletariat, in combination with the skyrocketing of lawyers' fees, whereas people cannot afford to pay these fees. So what do I have? We have lawyers dependent on the state or on capitalists. They don't have the financial dependence to be able independently to exercise their duties. It transforms to the worse the notion of our work, the content of our work, our social consciousness. It does not respond to the needs of working people who cannot afford to have efficient legal defense, which becomes even more difficult. And also it becomes more difficult because of this jungle, this labyrinth of laws. In Greece, the situation is particularly difficult with this complicated legislation, this jungle of law. Still, a big number of lawyers is fighting inside and outside the court, and we will continue this struggle. I'm sorry for speaking for too long. Honor to our comrades who are in prisons in Turkey. We wish them strength and courage, and I'm sure sometimes they will come and will speak with us freely. And glory and honor to Titik Ebru.